Hello everybody, I hope you're all well. I'm the introverted astrologer and I just love looking at political charts. It seems incredible now that less than 4 months ago I'd made a video on Farage and I'd warned you that we had big changes ahead. At that time, all the polls were putting Farage clearly in front as the most likely next Prime Minister. I'd warned that many candidates like Starmer and Farage had got an unusual amount of mutable placements and that there would be huge disruptions in 2026 and into 2027 too. Now, even I would have had a job believing that Farage would have stood down, triggered a by-election and then won again as an MP. This victory is an unusual one though, because the other major parties refused to participate. So although the support in Clacton is clearly there for Farage, that's undisputed, but he has dropped substantially in the polls and the whole political terrain is changed. Moreover, that parliamentary investigation into Nigel Farage's financial interests has resumed again. So has the disruption that I warned you about cleared away now? Well, we've seen the first wave of it, but I don't think we're finished yet. So let's go and have a look at the next few months. So as we begin looking at Farage's chart, I just want to remind you of my aim to be impartial in my astrology. So I'm transparent about this. I lean to the left of the political spectrum. I feel a little undecided on anybody at the moment, but I am certain that I won't be voting for Reform or the Conservatives in the next election. I do want to give everybody's chart a fair assessment, regardless of whether I support them or not. I want the astrology to shine through. Now, in the case of Farage, we are hugely helped by the fact that he has a rough birth time. This is the widely used time for Farage. It does come from memory and it has a Rodden rating of A. Now, because I do have that birth time, I have the positions of the angles and the houses and what a difference this makes. But those angles are going to be hugely important in today's video. The reason why I say this is because when we have planets conjunct an angle, their energy is amplified hugely. And if we have multiple planets placed on our different angles, all of that planetary energy is amplified so greatly the planets can even behave in a maverick or extreme way. Now, as we begin by looking at Farage's chart, it's very important for us to understand that two very different cycles are playing out for him right now. And these cycles aren't just affecting a single planet. They're triggering off the dynamo that is in his birth chart and which has multiple key planets playing a part. And the only way that we can understand the wider picture is by backtracking and considering the highly dynamic and tense engine which is forever running in the background of his chart. What do I mean? Well, let's start by looking at the angles of his chart and considering the planets that are on them. So if we step back and look at Farage's ascendant, we have two very powerful outer planets, Uranus and Pluto, within a conjunction, and so Farage's whole self-expression in this lifetime will always be done through the lens of that Uranus-Pluto conjunction. I suspect many of my viewers may well have this conjunction too, and so do I, but in Farage's case, this energy is magnified. Now, this is a conjunction that took place in the 1960s, and so we had that whole era of a desire for great societal improvements, but it was accompanied by the drive for more personal freedoms. So we could see that many societal movements towards freedom, equality, liberation were introduced in the 60s. And what I'm driving at is that these two planets together brought in this generational impulse to tear down anything that was obsolete, defunct, no longer served the people. And we can see this with Farage, who does indeed challenge any structures or conventional ways of doing things which he sees as inhibiting our personal freedoms or ways in which society works which he finds oppressive. If we track over to the other end of the ascendant, which is the descendant here, we have the very powerful asteroid called Chiron conjunct this cusp, which also starts the mark of the 7th house. So this is also explaining to us that this is somebody whose development is going to come about by encountering the other, because the descendant is where we find our relationships with other people. These can be our marriage partners, but they can also be our opponents, our rivals, our allies. And it is through his interactions with other people that Farage may find his sense of self is challenged. And perhaps this also explains something about Farage's political career, because it has actually been quite an adversarial stance that he's taken and held for many years now. He doesn't operate in isolation. He defines himself through being in opposition to other political parties and their ideologies. And this is also an area where Farage may be more vulnerable, because this is what the asteroid Chiron also represents. Our vulnerability may be more exposed and visible through our confrontations with people around us. I do also want to pull in Saturn in this conversation, because strictly speaking it is not in conjunction to his descendant, but it is certainly opposing his Uranus, which is conjunct the ascendant. Saturn and Uranus don't blend together so easily, because Saturn thrives on stability, form, structure, and Uranus is not interested in those things whatsoever. It will question whether structures are still serving us, and if they aren't, it brings in the disruption to set us free. And so we're seeing some very powerful tensions already in how Farage engages with the world. Farage has another very important asteroid, Paralysed, on his IC, the cusp of his 4th house, where we look for security and roots. And Pallas is a highly strategic, intelligent asteroid that, if placed prominently, she equips us with the intelligence and strategy to go into battle against others. And it's not Saturday night brawling kind of battles. Pallas is extremely wise. And so the battles are carefully selected. We are fearless but highly discriminating in the tactics we use. If we now track up to another one of the angles, the midheaven, this is our public presence. It's our career. It can be our reputation. It's how the world sees us. And you can see that Farage has the planet Venus pretty nearby his midheaven. It is within conjunction to the midheaven, but also forms tense angles with his Saturn and his Uranus. Now, what I'm trying to do by recapping all this stuff is I'm trying to encourage you to view these angles and clusters of planets very closely, because there are two important cycles going on for Farage at the moment, and both of these involve not only his angles but the planets that are posited around them. And given all the tension that is generated by these placements, you can understand how Farage is driven and packed with the potential and the tension to keep driving forward. So I'd mentioned that there were two very important developmental cycles going on. Now, one of those current cycles involves the planet Uranus. We knew that this agitator was coming, and we've been able to trace the progress of Uranus as it firstly made a conjunction to his natal Venus. then moved on to square his Saturn, and is currently edging ever closer to his midheaven. Now, the points when Uranus conjuncted his Venus and moved on to square his Saturn coincided with the emerging furore over donations to both Farage personally and to his party. And so as this information came to light, this was pounced upon by the current government, and legislation was introduced to prevent huge gifts of money or cryptocurrency from persons or organisations abroad. In Farage's case, it does seem that Venus is not only about his personal relationships or values, but it is most certainly also symbolic of his finances and the values he places on security. We must of course remember that his Venus is square with Saturn. One of the old cookbook ways of viewing Venus-Saturn aspects like this would be to interpret this as being somebody who is afraid of love, or who frequently encounters restrictions or disappointments in personal relationships. But we can put a more political slant on this one, because the Venus in Taurus has very definite ideas about value, worth, finances, assets, and the relationship with Saturn means that those values could keep bumping up against the realities of operating within an institutional system which has rules and duties, and as a political figure, Farage is encountering some disappointing restrictions on how he can enjoy the financial stability that he desires. Now, the transit from Uranus to Venus and Saturn has now moved behind us. And I know a lot of you are astrologically aware and are probably wondering what on earth will happen as Uranus reaches the area of Farage's midheaven. At that point, it will also begin its first square to his natal Uranus. I think this is going to make September extremely interesting. And this is because Uranus in the sky is going to reach the area of 5 degrees and 42 minutes of Gemini. This is within a degree of his midheaven if we assume that the 4:30 time is totally accurate. I am actually wondering if that midheaven edges slightly closer to 7 degrees than 6, but we will have to see. Anyway, as Uranus reaches the area of 5 degrees and 42 minutes in the second week of September, it stations, and it then turns retrograde and tracks back through the early degrees of Gemini. It gets to around 1 degree and 41 minutes of Gemini before turning direct next February. But this September is going to be very interesting. A lot depends on how accurate Nigel's birth time is. Now, when Uranus passes over our midheaven, we certainly might expect changes or disruption, and it can go either way. In other words, those disruptions may be most unwelcome and redefine the way that we are seen publicly, what our formal role or profession in the world is. Uranus passing over our midheaven may be experienced as a change which is very liberating. We find our public role changed in ways which are exciting and bring new freedoms for us. So in late May and June of 2027, there could be further changes and potentially also restrictions around our ability to act freely in a way that makes us feel like we are honouring our authentic self. Now, can Farage breathe a sigh of relief once Uranus clears away from his midheaven and his natal Uranus? Does it get easier after 2028? And my honest answer has to be no, because Uranus in the sky is of course going to move a little further forward and will begin to square with his ascendant and his Pluto, which is so closely caught up on his ascendant. And so this transit from Uranus will still be around even as we move into election year. Moreover, even post-election, Uranus will not have finished the total cycle involved in activating the angles and the planetary bodies that are placed on them. And so we looked earlier at how Farage's self-development also comes through the lens of his connection to other people. His sense of who he is challenged through his relationships with other people, which sometimes bring in a vulnerability and even collateral damage, and Uranus will continue to trigger this even after 2029. And so we have to look at the whole cycle of planets and angles which Uranus is slowly picking off. And instead of looking at each thing as an isolated incident, we can see that there is an interwoven story with different chapters, and we're not sure how the Chiron chapter will play out yet. The Uranus Chiron chapter could even well be experienced through the actions of his allies, which bring a wounding or an inadequacy to his movement, which he has to explain or defend to the public. But the general theme of it is that our growth is partly fueled by vulnerability and visibility through our confrontations with other. Will the disruption be such that Farage or his party are prevented from appearing on the ballot paper by 2029? My honest answer to you is that I don't believe so. For those of you who are actually supporting Farage, I have put together a bit of history for you towards the end of this video, where we do step back in time and we look at the last time that transits from Uranus were picking off this entire constellation. I wanted to show you that this man is very dynamic, very resilient and very intelligent, and he does manage to bounce back from these periods. Now, I'd mentioned that there were two important cycles going on, and the only way to understand the second one is to shift into a form of astrology which we call the progressions. And this is where we move one day forward in our ephemeris for every 1 year that the person has been alive. And looking at the chart in this way is very revealing, because although it is slower moving, we can track the progress of Farage's progressed sun and understand how it describes the gradual unfolding of his life direction, his identity, and the sun also describes our unfolding consciousness and something of our ego too. And I showed you earlier how we should look at all of these planets and angles in this heavy configuration as a whole and understand that his progressed sun has been moving over this heavy natal pattern for the last 14 years. It was way back in 2011 when his progressed sun was on his natal Venus, and the progressed sun moved further forward to square his Saturn, to cross over his midheaven, to square with his Uranus, his ascendant, and his Pluto, all within a period of about 13 years. And this is fascinating because it correlates with the years in which Farage has become increasingly visible with his message. I don't know if you can remember the first year when you became vaguely aware of Nigel Farage, but there's no question that he's become increasingly visible with his particular message. He's been very vocal. He has stepped more and more into the public spotlight over those years, and he's altered the landscape of British politics. Whether you support him or not, his contribution to our unfolding politics has been massive. I will put some of the more exact dates of his sun progressions up on the screen for you to consider. And I am tracking over a number of years, but there's a reason why I'm bringing this up now. Because the progressed sun is triggering off a extended natal constellation. What we have seen is successive stages unfolding in his identity. And instead of looking at each of these contacts with the progressed sun as being an isolated event, again, It's more useful to look at it as a larger unfolding story whereby Farage has become more influential, a household name, and has also repeatedly reinvented his public identity. He is an exceptionally versatile character. Now, the passage of that progressed sun over this natal constellation is not yet complete. So what is the next chapter in the story? The progressed sun was contacting his natal ascendant and his Pluto in the months leading up to the election in 2024. And of course he was successful in becoming an MP. But that story is not over yet. The progressed sun is currently around 14.5 odd degrees of Gemini. And so what will happen in just under a couple of years' time is that it will square with Chiron. The Chiron which is symbolic of this vulnerability or exposure through the lens of his associations with people and allies around him. So what will this involve? I can't concretely predict a precise event, but I can describe the landscape of it. So Farage's relationships with other, be this individuals, opponents, allies, with whom he has relationships, well, that vehicle of relationship will introduce some kind of vulnerability and expose it. And through that exposure or wounding, we could expect Farage to need to find a different way of relating to others which fosters his own self-development. So this could very well be a scandal of some sort which comes about through the behaviour of others. Perhaps one of the formal relationships he has trips off some renewed scrutiny from Parliament. It could be any manner of events like that. So I hope I've been able to show you that there are two distinct development cycles going on here, and neither of them is yet finished. And returning to the other progressions and transits that Farage has going on, it's little wonder that his life is so very intense at the moment. I've already explained previously that Saturn is moving through his 8th house. It's only part way through its contact with Farage's sun. And of course in a birth chart we look at the 8th house for themes of intensity, change, reinvention. It's also where we find the finances or resources that we share with other people. So other people's money and shared resources are very apt at the moment. Now his progressed moon is going to stay in this 8th house for some time yet, until roughly around the end of 2028, and so that gives you an idea of his current battles. Moreover, he has a very undermining transit from Neptune at the moment. Farage is an Aries. Mars rules the sign of Aries, so it's his sun ruler. And his natural Martian instinct is to initiate, to fight back, to be brave, to be bold. And under the transit from Neptune, those Martian instincts are being undermined. Neptune is far more concerned with surrender, with uncertainty. It dissolves and breaks things down. And so Farage's instinctive ways of handling any difficulties may not work during this pretty lengthy transit period. Neptune actually stations direct on Farage's Mars next year in December of 2027. It's very close to Mars when it makes this station, and that will be an interesting time too. December next year could well be when Neptune makes its final point of asking Farage to let go of an old way of fighting back so that he can develop a different response. Again, does this mean that his political goals need to be behind him? Absolutely not. We have a strong natal chart here and an extremely resilient and tenacious man. Moreover, Reform UK is an organisation in its own right, and I cannot believe that it would fold and disappear. I'll also add that as we step forward into 2027, we have the involvement of another major outer planet, Pluto, and Pluto involves huge power, transformation, metamorphosis, even with a trine, this won't always be easy, and I'm not going to represent it as such. The trine will bring in opportunities for Farage to fundamentally regenerate his public role, find ways to deepen and renew his own personal authority and power. This could well also mark a fresh phase in which he's able to perhaps reverse some of the decline in the polls that we've seen since June. If we consider Farage's profections, he is aged 62 at the moment, and that means that his third house is where we look to consider his profections. The sign associated with the third house is the sign of Scorpio, whether we are using whole sign or Placidus, and Scorpio is traditionally ruled by Mars. This means that the 8th house, which keeps cropping up, is relevant this year, but any transits to his own natal Mars or transits he receives from transiting Mars in the sky are also pivotal during this year. We already know that he's having a transit from outer planet Neptune to his Mars, but towards the end of this August and early September, we have some important activity from the planet Mars as it travels through the sky. So end of August, early September, Mars will be at roughly 13 to 14 degrees of Cancer. Saturn will be retrograding through 14 down to 13 degrees of Aries, and so the two planets will form a tense 90-degree aspect to each other. This is exactly where Farage's Sun is, at 13 odd degrees of Aries, and so this very tense square between two rather difficult planets could become very important. Do watch out for those days. We also have a double whammy at this time because his progressed moon is inching closer and closer to his natal Mars in those few days. So this could be volatile, and it is certainly a week when Farage would be advised to keep a check on his temper, to keep buying himself time and step back from the situation, to appraise it intelligently before acting. Now, transits from Mars later this year will be important too, because Mars will continue moving forward during the year and will eventually reach his natal Uranus. Of course, it will simultaneously square his midheaven roughly in mid-December. By January 2027, it gets to around 10.5 degrees of Virgo before it begins backtracking. As it turns retrograde, it's going to be moving very slowly, and so it will be picking off multiple points in Farage's chart as it reverses back to 21 degrees of Leo. Now, these lengthy retrograde periods from Mars do tend to impact us quite strongly if they pull in a lot of planets in our natal chart, and Mars will be doing precisely that. And so this all hints at Mars provoking Farage's Uranian need for independence and for change. There will be confrontation with Saturn, which is placing limits and restrictions on ambitions. There could be tension in our relationships and our resources or values. So again, there is further tension, but not necessarily defeat, because it is activating the 12th house too. We may simply need to metaphorically retreat, to rethink about how we fight for what we want, how we stand our ground. And I'm sure he will, because this very same Mars retrograde will also draw in his Jupiter-Mercury conjunction and that moon in Sagittarius. In fact, most of his chart is really brought alive by this Mars retrograde transit, and so I would be more likely to anticipate that Farage is going to stick to his guns and search passionately for fresh, intelligent solutions to any problems he encounters in this period. The progressions that are coming up around 2029, when we anticipate that there will most likely be the next election, are showing a very different picture. Farage's progressed moon is in the far more expansive 9th house, where we find our belief systems, the enlarging of our horizons, and an overall much lighter tone to life events around us. Now, This of itself isn't guaranteeing political success in terms of landing the prime ministerial role, but there is something interesting which I have seen before, and it concerns his progressed ascendant. Now at this time, May 2029, the ascendant is at approximately 27 degrees and 15 minutes of Libra. What this tells us, though, is that his descendant is therefore at 27 degrees of Aries, which means it is moving closer and closer to conjunct with his natal Jupiter. We could broadly say that perhaps benefits or enlargement come through our relationships with other people. Jupiter is where we grow. We develop our beliefs about the world and our place in it. The emphasis is how we grow and develop ourselves through our connection with other, because the descendant is our formal allies, partnerships, and even opponents. And I've been looking at this quite closely because as we are at present, the polls are indicating the chances of a coalition government are possible. And this would be just one sign of this potential of needing to learn and grow through close cooperation with others. One sign is not enough. I need to look at the country's charts in 2029 too, and I need to consider the wider picture. Now, for those of you who are supporting Farage and are interested in how he has responded historically to more difficult Uranus transits, we can step back in time to around April or May of 2004. And at that time, Uranus was moving through early Pisces, and it began to square Farage's midheaven, and it opposed his natal Uranus. And the sequence of events that played out over this couple of years were very interesting because it marked a few years which were quite heavy in terms of disruption. Back in 2004, UKIP won 112 seats in the European elections. And a very well-known public figure by the name of Robert Kilroy-Silk joined the UKIP party, and he rapidly became a challenger to its leadership. There was a big fallout, rather a lot of internal political angst, and by 2005, Kilroy-Silk left UKIP and he formed his own party. He took some people with him, and during this whole process, Farage did not disappear. Ultimately, during a couple of very tumultuous years, he was actually elected leader of the UKIP party, and he replaced its former leader, who was a gentleman by the name of Roger Napman. So the same period of tense Uranus transits that brought disruption to the UKIP party structure ended up with Farage taking control of the organisation himself. And I just wanted to explain this so that you can see that although Uranus may take away an existing setup or configuration, it may be precisely because something new needs to take its place in order for us to express ourselves authentically. And in that entire overhaul, Farage himself emerged with new strength and increased visibility. So I think it would be more accurate for me to point out that Uranus does bring disruption, it brings tension, it brings illumination, but it doesn't need to bring a total ending and a collapse. What happened then as Uranus moved on to trigger his natal Chiron? I can't be sure what was happening in Farage's personal life, but it did coincide with a political period when allies or members of UKIP brought some embarrassment to the party. I think one of them was jailed for benefit fraud. Another two members became embroiled in serious financial and legal difficulties. And so there is this interesting theme of people around Farage becoming a source of embarrassment and vulnerability, of bringing in events which then leave Farage having to find public ways of dealing with that. So again, scandal and embarrassments are possible but not insurmountable. Thank you for watching. I've been quiet for a while, and the reason is that my whole schedule was interrupted by another surgery in early July. I knew I was going to have a surgery, but I hadn't expected it so soon. So I'm recovering, but I'm not quite up to speed yet. I'm trying to make up for lost time though, and so I've had a super hard look at Burnham's chart and his numerology. Now that we have this vastly changed political landscape, where does he fit into it? I'm recording the video on him today, and I will edit and upload within the next 3 days. So keep an eye open for that one. It is very interesting. And until then, take the best care of yourselves, and God bless you all.